Morning, this is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church, and the devotion this morning is from the book of Genesis, chapter 11. Now, in man's recent history, we've just experienced the flood. We've experienced the rainbow, which was a reminder of God's promise He'd never destroy the earth again by means of a flood. We've got Noah and his kids repopulating the earth. When you look at chapter 11, Noah has passed on and has gone to be with the Lord, but his kids are left. And in chapter 10, we find that it gives us a list of their lineage and the individuals that were born unto them, gives us an idea of what the population of the earth was at the time. In chapter 11, though, this is where we deal with the Tower of Babel, and we find that it begins by saying that the people were moving eastward. And as they were moving eastward, they came to a place called Shinar. And the thing about the place called Shinar was that it was a place that had the components in the ground, if you would, that was suitable for making bricks. Prior to that, they were using rocks and tar and pitch and things that were there that were of the natural source, but in Shinar they found a substance that was giving them the capability to make bricks. And the first thing they began to do when they began to make bricks was they started building a city, which in itself is not a bad thing, but as we go on we'll find out that the intent may not have been pure. And then within the city they began to build a tower. We refer to it in the Bible as the Tower of Babel, because this is where God confounded their language and dispersed them to cover the whole earth and to move out from that area and to go about populating the earth, which is actually part of the fulfillment of what God gave to Noah when He said, "Go forth and populate the earth," back over in chapter 6. So this was just God carrying out what He said He wanted man to do, because God knows what's best for man, even though man thinks he knows what's best for himself. And a good example of that is what happened in the Tower of Babel. So they start to build this city, and one of the things we find as you look at chapter 11, begin with verse 4. There's four keynote points in verse 4 that we want to mention. It says that they would build for themselves the city, and it would have a tower that would reach the heavens. And the reason they wanted a tower was so that they may make a name for themselves, and it would be what would hold them together so that they wouldn't be scattered all over the earth. Now you break these 4 points down, and here's some of the intent behind what they were trying to do. And that's what we've got to look at. We've got to look not so much at their actions, because their actions are a reflection of their inward intent. And here's what they intended to do through these 4 phrases. When they talked about build for ourselves, this wasn't about God. It was about what they could do without God's help. Just like in the days of Noah, when people had reached the point that they did, that their sin was so wicked and they didn't feel that they had a need for God, even though it all began with Adam and Eve, and the story had been shared by Adam and Eve through Cain and Abel and what Cain did to Abel, and throughout all of man's history we've always known what God has done for us. But once again, society has cycled back around to where they had that attitude that they felt that they could do something for themselves and that they didn't need the help of God. In fact, they didn't even want God intruding in their life. They'd reached that point to where God was an interference to what they wanted to do, because they felt they knew what they wanted to do better than what God did. That's really kind of reflective of where we are as a society today. Society as today doesn't want God interfering in their life, telling them what He wants them to do, because men typically are sinners, and when God says you don't need to be doing that, the reaction can either be to repent or to rebel. And we find that in this day that these people were rebelling against God, and they wanted to do it themselves. The second thing it goes on and says is that they wanted to build a tower, which within itself is probably not a bad thing. You look at the Tower of Eiffel over there in Italy. You look at the Statue of Liberty. You look at other things that have been built, and yet you find that no, those were intended to reach the heavens, and that's what separates what they were doing from everything else that man has done or man has tried to do. This is a tower that would reach the heavens. What this was about was building an idol or building a symbol that man would not need to worship God, but instead he could worship himself for what he did. They wanted to be able to build a tower in their way of thinking, which was wrong. Their way of thinking, they could build a tower that would reach up into heaven so that they could be like God, or they could be equal with God. That's kind of what Satan wanted out of the serpent, wasn't it? When he tempted Eve, what did he say to Eve? You'll be like God. Man has always had a sinful nature from a bad intent to want to be like God. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be like God, but not at the expense of bypassing Jesus Christ, who can give us God-like qualities and characters because he lives within us. These individuals wanted to build a tower into heaven because they wanted to replace God or be co-equal with God. The third thing is so that we can make a name for ourselves. And this was intended to replace God by their own works, getting them heaven. The Bible says, salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. They wanted to make a name for themselves. That's exactly what they said in verse 4. Build ourselves a tower that will reach to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. And what they wanted to do was replace the name of God with their own name. That's kind of the way it is in the world today. People are constantly wanting to remove the name of God, whether it's from the public buildings, whether it's from the schoolhouse, or from anywhere else, from the back of the police cars where it says, "In God we trust." There's a segment of society that's just like the people at the Tower of Babel that want to take out the name of God, because when you remove the name of God, you remove the reminder and the accountability that God is watching everything we do, as we're about to look at. The fourth thing was this: not be scattered over the face of the earth. And God's response in verse 5 was this: but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building, and the Lord said, if one people speaking the same language have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. It wouldn't be a bad thing that they could all speak the same language, but that's what was unifying them for improper intent. And so they had to be dispersed, kind of like a police officer coming in and having to disperse a crowd that is getting out of control or doing things wrong. You send in the authority to disperse the crowd. Why? Because they're not doing the right thing. Even though they may all be able to communicate the same language, they're not doing the right thing. Now, God looked down, and what he saw was a population who were heading in the wrong direction spiritually. And so God did the kindest thing. He didn't destroy them. He could have. I mean, after all, they were trying to build an alternate way to heaven that was going to mislead a lot of people and take them to hell. And so God could have just wiped them out and said, forget it. I'm going to find a few righteous people out of you like I did with Noah. I'm going to wipe you out. God had that right to do that. But instead what he did was he confounded their language, and as a result, they had to disperse. Now, he confounded the wise. All these guys that thought they were so wise and going to build a tower and get it to heaven, God, who is the wisest of all, confounded mankind who just thought he was wise. He established barriers between man to man, but he did not establish a barrier between man and God. He established himself as why he was God, and if they wanted to find God and they wanted to find heaven, they weren't going to do it through something they built with their hands. They were going to have to do it by building a personal relationship with God through his Son, Jesus Christ. He made it harder for man to do the wrong thing by dispersing them, which was an act of love. He sent them to their respective corners. He separated them. He put a barrier between them that would make it harder for them to get together to do the wrong thing. That was an act of love on the part of God. And while man could not communicate with fellow man, man could understand God's language of love. As time goes on, we find that we're about to get into where Abraham comes on the picture or comes into the scene. And this is how God shows his love, that he didn't give up on man when man was doing the wrong thing. He just showed man a better way. And my prayer today is that you'll find the better way, and you'll find God's way, and that you will speak a language that God understands, while you may be confounded by the language that the world speaks to you. So let's go out and let's speak the name of God.